This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, I'm standing in for Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. I want to quickly update listeners about the future of Knowing Animals. Many of you will know that Siobhan O'Sullivan, the podcast's regular host, was diagnosed last year with ovarian cancer. Some of you may have read the article about ovarian cancer that she wrote for ABC, which was published on the 15th of February. Now, Siobhan is still planning to record a few more episodes of Knowing Animals for release over the course of this year, so that's something for us all to look forward to. However, Siobhan and I have agreed that, for the foreseeable future, it's best if my involvement with the podcast remains. This means that regular listeners will be hearing a lot more from me as we go forward. And while I'm sure we'd all like to see Siobhan return to regular hosting, this just does not seem like the best option at the present time. I'm sure all of our listeners will join me in wishing Siobhan the best. Before I introduce today's guests, let me give a very quick shout out to our sponsors. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. To learn more about ASA, that's AASA, you can follow them on Twitter or on Facebook, or you can check out their website. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. And I'm pleased to say that Siobhan plans to talk to some of the authors of recent books in that series for future episodes of Knowing Animals. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Lynda Korimboccus. Lynda is a real Renaissance woman with a background in psychology, philosophy, politics, and sociology. She completed an MA in anthrozoology at the University of Exeter in 2019 and will hopefully be starting a PhD in sociology later in 2021. And since 2006, she's been a lecturer in social sciences at West Lothian College in Scotland. And in 2020, she was appointed the student editor-in-chief of the new Student Journal for Vegan Sociology, which is published by the International Association for Vegan Sociologists. Today, we're going to be talking about her paper, Pig Ignorance, the Peppa Pig Paradox, Investigating Contradictory Childhood Consumption, which was published in the Journal for Critical Animal Studies in 2020. Welcome to the podcast, Lynda.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
One of the nice things about being an academic is that I sometimes get to ask some very strange or surprising questions with a completely straight face. So, Lynda, and bearing in mind that we have a very mixed and international audience here at Knowing Animals, could you tell us who Peppa Pig is?
Well, many listeners may be familiar with Peppa if they have children under the age of, 12 probably. She's been around for quite a while, but she's an animated character on children's television, mostly on Channel 5's Milkshake preschool schedule, so between 6 and 9:15 in the morning you'll find her various episodes, usually 6 or thereabouts. She has a reputation for being mildly irritating to grown-ups, but she's a character that's much loved by little people, particularly little girls. Member of a family of other pigs, Mummy and Daddy Pig is very inventive, and her little brother George, and the series is all about the antics of them and their daily lives, going to the dentist, going to school, nursery, riding bikes, all that kind of thing. So she's well known to anyone with children or two little children.
And what was it that led you to think about Peppa Pig from a critical animal studies perspective?
It's interesting actually, because this all really goes back 20 years or more to me turning vegan in the first place, which was in 1999, in the summer of 99. So more than 20 years in the making, this paper. The first thing that led me to veganism was my acknowledgement, and it was a real quick overnight realisation that I loved cows, for example, and people would buy me cow presents, soft toys and toilet roll holders and all sorts of very interesting accoutrements. And yet I still ate cows in one form or another. Fast forward to me going through a whole bunch of social science study to try and figure out why other people, once they were armed with the knowledge that I had gained, refused or denied or were really quite defensive about the possibility of them changing their habits. I went vegetarian straight away the minute I'd made the connection, and vegan very quickly thereafter. So fast forward again, still no answers through all the undergraduate study. I then took a break from postgraduate study to have my daughter Maya, who's born in 2014. And I raised her vegan from the very moment she was born, much to some people's disgust, I have to say. When she was about 4, a friend and I took Maya and her daughter to a Peppa Pig show. It was like a live show in a theatre. And in the cafeteria beforehand, we'd got there a little early. And there was a little girl sitting in all her Peppa Pig finery. She had a little bag and some hair clips and a t-shirt and all that stuff. And she was sitting eating a ham salad. And I thought, that is really interesting. Our mum's not really thought much about presenting her. It was clear, well, at least I presumed it was clear she was going to the same show that we were. And there she was eating some ham salad whilst wearing a Peppa Pig t-shirt. I thought this was really interesting. When we got into the theatre, you could order a box for the break, a snack box for the kids, and one of the options there was ham sandwiches. And later in that year, a similar thing happened at the Peppa Pig cinema experience. So this was a show that you could take your kids to, and it was basically a whole bunch of Peppa Pig episodes back to back with some chat in between. And the hot dog stand was open, and there the kids were all sitting lined up, ready to order hot dogs. And I think I just decided that I needed to write something about this specifically, about Peppa Pig specifically, because she permeated my everyday life, frankly, as well as that of my daughters. And the Peppa Pig Paradox paper was born, lots of alliteration there. I had the opportunity through the anthrozoology masters to write about the animal mirror and how animals are represented back to us through various means, and it seemed a perfect opportunity to write about it.
What do you understand by this phrase Peppa Pig Paradox? What is that exactly?
The paradox itself is the contradictory behaviour. It's developed from Steve Loughnane and others' meat paradox back in 2012, I think, where there's an acknowledgement, and it's the one that I realised in 1999 and others have recognised for a while, that people say they're animal lovers, particularly in the UK. It's, we talk about ourselves being a nation of animal lovers, and yet at the same time, most dinner plates have dead animal of some sort on them, whether it be lamb or beef or chicken or pork or fish or something. So the paradox here, the meat paradox, is about people who say they love animals but eat other animals, but often they're not the same species. We have these categorizations of these animals are for eating, these animals are to have in your house that you love and that we call pets. These animals you go and look at behind cages or in tanks. That would be maybe aquaria and zoo animals. But Peppa Pig in particular, we were talking about the same species here. So kids love this little character, Peppa, and yet at the same time, they'll be sitting often watching Peppa eating a bacon butty. And bacon sandwich for those of you that aren't familiar with it, the slang. But I just thought that this was particularly interesting and massively paradoxical and needed investigation. So the Peppa Pig paradox is really looking at that contradiction between the belief and the love of animals and of a character that Peppa Pig is, and the behaviour, which is the eating of pigs at the same time as loving the character.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that Peppa Pig is a pig, because that's actually something that you question in the article to a certain extent. So you have this section where you say, what is Peppa? I was reminded of discussions that I've seen of the difference between, say, Black Beauty, which is a novel from the perspective of a horse, and, say, Beatrix Potter's children's stories. And the characters in Beatrix Potter's stories, although they're animals, animals like Peter Rabbit, they're very much anthropomorphized. They wear little clothes and things. So I've heard people argue that Beatrix Potter teaches compassion for anthropomorphized animals rather than for animals themselves. Do you think there's potentially something similar going on in the case of Peppa Pig?
I think very much so. There's definitely some anthropomorphism evident, and I talk about that in the paper. Some argue that Pig is just the surname of the character for all intents and purposes, she and her family are human-like in terms of their life, their work, their schooling, the hobbies that they have. So I can see that perspective. Nonetheless, her little brother George oinks and they all slosh about in muddy puddles here and there. And the other animals, again, who all have Rebecca Rabbit, for example, Susie Sheep, but they all have something about them in terms of the noises that they make sometimes, as well as speaking in English. They definitely hint towards the species that they are meant to be. As with many animated characters, they are a representation of something that children will recognise in order to have a moral lesson behind them or something like that. So I understand that point. However, I think they're piggish enough in order not to draw completely away from the fact that they are represented as those characters.
So, do you think that there's something important in the fact that Peppa Pig, who is such a popular children's character, is of a species that we might normally associate with being food?
I think that is relevant, and actually recent research I've done that's due to be published later in the year looks exactly at these different species that are represented on TV, and she's one of the few food animals, as we could categorise her, that's present on television. Most of the other animal characters and animations are wildlife species. You mentioned Peter Rabbit, animals like that. So it's very unusual, and I could only find a couple of examples in more than 300 programmes across last summer that had any link with what we would consider an edible species, at least in the UK. So that's quite particular, and pigs haven't been known for being popular characters or animal species to use for children's characters. So I think that makes it even more relevant that she's so loved despite being a pig. So yeah, other than Peppa and her family and the other animals in Peppa Pig, there's also Shaun the Sheep's little cousin Timmy, who has his own show, Timmy Time. Again, though, actually in that particular case, there's no speech at all. It's just animal noises. So I think that the lack of food animals in children's television is actually perhaps a nod to the fact that people recognise the potential problems that would come out of including them.
That's very interesting. So that seems to suggest that having characters like Peppa Pig could potentially be disruptive for our current food relationships with animals.
Absolutely. This all comes from us being socialised into this normative belief system that, this animal is, categorisation of animals into different uses, all useful for people, of course, but different uses. So whether that's as companions or as exhibits or as dinner. So I do wonder whether or not the lack of presence of these species, there aren't any lead character cows, for example, in any of the programmes that I have been studying, and that has been quite a lot. The lamb is one thing. Fish, I guess, are a little bit more tricky to animate in a believable way. But yeah, disruption is certainly something that I'm willing to do in order to make people think differently, which is what social science is all about.
You talk about a lot more than just Peppa Pig in this article, and you talk about the socialization of children into particular ideologies about animals a great deal. And I was really interested to see a conversation you included about the different attitudes that schools seem to have towards external speakers who are supporting the meat industry and those who might be a little bit more critical of the meat industry. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I worked as a campaigns manager for an animal protection organisation in Scotland for a couple of years. And we had decided, as with a lot of the bigger charities, the UK-wide charities, that we would maybe start a school speakers programme. And initially the response to that was very positive. The schools were keen for us to go in and discuss a variety of different issues. However, they were very clear at that time, although things are changing, I believe, but at that time they did not want me. They were absolutely categorical in their refusal to allow me to discuss meat-free diets as part of a change in attitudes to animals. So they were happy that I discuss with very young children, primary one onwards, so age 4 and 5 upwards, discuss anything. Even vivisection wasn't beyond reach in terms of discussion, but they already acknowledged and could anticipate there being a backlash from parents when kids would go home and go, oh, Mum, I love animals, but I've decided not to eat them anymore. This woman was at our school and she said, and the next thing you know, the school has a complaint or 7. So I found that really disheartening at the time, going back maybe 20 years or 15 years anyway, that it was fine to discuss animals in any other way, but in the way that we probably use and misuse and abuse, and some would say the most, which is for food.
Yes, I hear when you say that perhaps things are changing, and you do finish the article on quite a positive note. You talk about how Peppa might be a catalyst. I think the phrase you use is for a meat-free generation. Now, in demographic terms, I'm guessing you're talking roughly about Generation Alpha, who were those born in the early 2010s through to the mid 2020s. So I guess your daughter would fall into Generation Alpha. So why are you hopeful for this generation? And do you think that Pepper herself has a big part to play in that?
I would hope so. I'm generally an optimist by nature, in any case. But since becoming vegan myself, and I'm going back now 2 decades, when even being vegetarian was still quite difficult in terms of social acceptability, the last couple of years in particular have become a real eye opener for me, where plant-based food choices have become not quite the norm, but certainly socially acceptable and in every supermarket. And I did not see that as being something that would happen in my lifetime. I am optimistic that now, when my daughter's in high school and they're all wanting to go to one of these fast food joints for something to eat after school, although I'm not a fan of these places, there's going to be a choice for her that means that she won't feel excluded in the way that I certainly might have had I been her age at that time. So I am optimistic. I do think things are changing. I think the environmental push towards reducing climate change or slowing down climate change, reducing our greenhouse gases and emissions, all these things, as well as the health benefits, which are almost beyond disagreement now. And I suppose just the general attitude that we have towards maybe being a little bit more mindful of what we put into our bodies for our own health. I can't see it have anything but some kind of fundamental shift in the future. Whether everyone goes vegan or not, that remains to be seen. But Peppa could certainly have a huge part to play here as a poster girl, if you like, poster pig for the meat-free generation. It's a lovely thought.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the Student Journal of Vegan Sociology. So, first, what is vegan sociology? And perhaps more specifically, what kind of work are you going to be looking for this journal?
The new Student Journal for Vegan Sociology comes out of the International Association for Vegan Sociologists, which launched fairly recently. It's quite a new venture all in. The journal has been mooted to provide an opportunity for students of sociology who happen to be vegan to provide work. It's difficult enough trying to become published, as I found very quickly. It's hard enough getting published. It's even more difficult when you're still an undergrad or you're still doing your master's, and the outlets for work can be quite limited when you haven't got, a little bit of a reputation or what have you. So the Student Journal for Vegan Sociology is a way to showcase the students, undergraduate and postgraduate and doctoral students even, what they're doing and to try and help to shift this normative stance towards animals. So we've been looking for any articles really that help to further the cause of veganism and social justice for people and animals. The two go hand in hand in my view. Anything that really furthers the cause of animals and trying to liberate them, I guess, from human use is fair game for the journal. Of course, we have a standard that we want to maintain, so it will be all articles will be double peer reviewed, and the best will make the cut. those that don't, we'll still offer a blog post too on the IAVS website too. So students will have an opportunity. It's still a specialist kind of branch of any kind of ology, really. So it's nice to have that chance for people to have their voices heard when they're already a minority, and then they're a further minority within academia.
And how can people find out more about the journal?
They can go to vegansociology.com/journal or click on the links there, and there's a lot of information there about what the journal's mission is, the association's mission, generally speaking, and the journal in particular. We're hoping the first issue will be out later this year. We're peer reviewing at the moment, but there will be opportunity again in future for the next issue. So we're very excited about it, and I'm delighted to have been appointed editor-in-chief. I've been vegan for such a long time and always been campaigning, so it feels like an extension of that to bring the campaign element of it, that kind of attempt to change things, as was Sociology's purpose in the first place. And to try and do that through the journal is going to be great.
Now, Lynda, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yep, sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I was thinking about this and I can't remember which I read in its entirety, but I did come across pro-animal scholarship during my second year undergrad in philosophy. And it was the standard Peter Singer, Tom Regan, Mary Midgley kind of combination, which was really interesting. But off the back of that, and I'm still not sure how I came across it, I read The Dreaded Comparison by Marjorie Spiegel, and that I did read cover to cover. So that's probably the first piece of scholarship I read in its entirety.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, it was actually the same year. So I think in the mid-2000s, I forget the exact time, but one of the modules it was the Open University module, Philosophy and the Human Situation it was called, and we had a whole module on humans and other animals. And alongside that scholarship that I had read with Peter Singer and Mary Midgley and Roger Scruton and various other people, not necessarily pro-animal in that case, I ended up being very critical of all of them, even Mary Midgley. I thought she didn't go far enough. And at that point, I utilised a bunch of other people that I'd started to read for fun in order to make my case against what I saw as a much more welfarist perspective, which I had definitely moved past very quickly once I discovered it. So yeah, I did an essay. I mean, I got good marks for that year. I did very well, got a distinction that year, which was super. And I'm lucky that my professor afforded us a little bit of original thought at that time, despite it being an undergraduate programme.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It's an interesting question because since starting the Masters Extra, the Anthrozoology Masters, I've come across a lot more scholars than I even knew existed. However, prior to that, the one that made the biggest impact on me in terms of my everyday life and my campaigns, and I suppose my ideology was actually Gary Francione, who writes from a more legal perspective about animals. And that's when I discovered the phrase abolitionism, being an abolitionist vegan, which is not to settle for trying to make things better for animals while they're still in cages or while they're still in captivity of some sort, but to abolish the use of animals altogether. That spoke very, very clearly to me at that time. So after the classics, I think it's probably his work more than anyone's that kind of prompted me to continue to be as keen an activist as I've remained.
Now, this is an interesting question for someone who's just identified as an abolitionist. What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Other than go vegan, I would say, I think everyone, academic or not, needs to maybe recognise inconsistencies of their own behaviours and belief systems and behaviours. But in terms of academia, I think experts need to be heard. And I don't know if it's a bugbear, but something that really I wish scholars would do more of is make themselves and their work more accessible to people. I'm a big believer in open access, and I mean open access in terms of publishing and being able to read work. I wish that people everyone would write in plain English a lot more to be understood by lay people, which is where the change needs to start, not academics writing for each other necessarily. So I do think that the biggest change that could be made and the most important thing to do would be to just get work out to the general population. Journals are fantastic, not taken away from that whatsoever, but perhaps just to make maybe articles in everyday publications that more people are going to read. I think that's the key to making a difference, because until then, experts aren't often heard. You can't change it if you don't hear it.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really useful comment. That's a really good thought. And I suppose it's worth emphasising that, for example, the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, where the paper on the Peppa Pig Paradox was published, that's an open access journal. So anyone can go and read that. You don't need university credentials.
Absolutely.
I think you're right. And I think there's a question about, it's not just about open access, as you say, it's about making it accessible, because it's no good uploading something to academia.edu, say, or another website like that, if it's all written in long, fancy kind of German or French sounding words. It needs to be readable.
Precisely. As an independent scholar, as I am at the moment, between my master's and my PhD, I haven't got any university access or institutional access of any sort at the moment to a lot of papers that up until not long ago I did. And that has been very difficult too. So if we're wanting people to make a difference, we have to have all of this knowledge available to anyone who wants to use it. It should be free. And by that, I mean truly free.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Now that's interesting too, because from an anthrozoological perspective, the view of the non-human is as important as the view of the human, but probably we can only look at how to change ourselves. And I would think that if we consider the non-human perspective a little bit more, try and minimise harm wherever possible, looking at practices that are unnecessary. So really I'm looking towards being vegan, of course. If I think that people that fight for social justice and equality need to recognise, or might recognise, the similarities between all of this work that's done, all of the academic work that's done in trying to promote different causes, when we're looking to just minimise exploitation, remove exploitation ideally. And one of the easiest and quickest ways to do that would be to adopt a vegan diet and the ethics that go with it, that would then also then help many exploited workers around the world and the environment. So it's a win-win.
What are you working on next?
Everything. I feel like I never stop. As well as teaching at college, I've just submitted a reflective piece on solitary scholarship, as I was just talking about. I'm hoping to present a couple of conferences and editing, of course, the first issue of the journal. So there's quite a lot going on, as well as hopefully starting the PhD later this year, which is going to be investigating the experiences of vegan children, which is a massively overlooked area of study. So quite a lot going on. In the meantime, without access to journals, I'm going to continue looking at things that I can access, which is television, doing some content analysis and thematic analysis of that. And another paper running on from the Peppa Pig Paradox paper about children's television more widely is hopefully going to be out in a postgraduate journal later in the year. So lots going on, never enough time, but always enough energy.
How can people find out more about your work?
Well, I do have my own very amateur-looking website, which is Korimboccus.com, but I am on academia.edu and ResearchGate, and I'm always floating about Twitter somewhere or other. But they can read the Peppa Pig paper on JCAS, the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, and I'm always posting up, thankfully because of open access, I'll always be posting up anything I do on academia or ResearchGate, so I'll be here or hereabouts.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for this episode, Lynda.
Thanks for having me, it's been a real pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at @veganphilosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast wherever you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.